You've probably heard murmurings about this paddle over the last couple of months. The hype that's built up has been pretty unreal. Now it's finally here. Today we're talking about the brand new Ronbus Ripple. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now I want you all to get nice and comfortable because we're reviewing the Ripple, and I don't think I've ever been this excited to talk about a paddle. I'm really happy because I've been on the Ronbus train for a while. The Novas proved to me that those guys can make a paddle both innovative and high performance, but they've really raised the bar here. This paddle is going to get a lot of people's attention, and I'm so happy it's coming from Ronbus because I have full confidence that these guys can build off this wave and keep making amazing stuff going forward. I can't wait to get into all of this because there's so much to unpack, but first let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So the Ronbus Ripple. Today I'm going to be talking about the R1 because it's the shape I'm most comfortable with, but I'll definitely be talking about the R2 soon, either in its own review or in a comparison video, because I know a lot of you are starting to really like that shape. If you do want me to talk about it in a comparison, let me know which paddle. I'm thinking the Scorpius 3S would be the most logical, but if you have any other ideas, I'm all ears. Now let's go over some specs. This paddle is 16.5 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle and has this arrow curve shape rather than the more standard elongated shape we usually see with R3 Ronbus paddles. And by the way, there's no R3 Ronbus Ripple, at least not yet. The weight specs are as follows. It weighs 7.8 ounces plus or minus 0.2 ounces. It has a 106 swing weight with a 5.33 twist weight. Now all of those are quite low, especially the swing weight and twist weight, and that combined with this arrow curve shape makes this paddle absolutely rapid. I'll talk more about that when I get into the playability sections, but finishing up with the specs, the face is Toray T700 carbon fiber, the core is 14 millimeters thick, and that core is made up of Ronbus's grid pattern technology infused with EVA foam. If you've watched any of our Ronbus content, you'll know that that carbon fiber grid is the important piece of tech that gives their Pulsars and their Novas extremely well-rounded playability. And foam is foam, we all know what it does at this point. It's been the main character this summer, it's the reason why the Gen 3 Yolas and the Gearbox Pro Powers are so powerful, and I really hope we don't have any issues with this going forward, especially not with the Ripple. This is a special paddle that's going to be a game changer for the right player, so let's unpack all of this great playability. First, I really want to explain just how unique of a feel this paddle has because understanding exactly how it feels is crucial to understanding why it's so good for power and other characteristics. First of all, you'll instantly notice that this is a foam paddle. The sound is very different, I think we all know that by now, and the ball pocketing itself is unique. Foam paddles feel soft but also powerful, and that's because of the spring effect foam provides. That sensation is certainly there on the Ronbus Ripple, but unlike the Yolas or a Gearbox Pro Power, the dwell time is long, but instead of being soft all the way through, there's a bit more resistance as the ball leaves the paddle face. I'm sure that's in part due to the thinner 14mm core, but I don't feel that resistance as much on a 14mm Yola or a Gearbox Pro Power, so I think it's actually the carbon fiber grid that's causing most of it. Now obviously, if you've watched our Nova or Pulsar FX reviews, you'll know how big of a fan I am of this technology. It adds an element of flexibility to the pocketing, but also firms up the exit point when you're looking for more power. Basically, it's dynamic, and so is the foam with its soft and springy effect, and it feels like those two dynamic characteristics work really well together because they're both soft at slower paces, and at faster paces, the rigidity complements the spring effect very well. Obviously, this has a positive effect on power, which we'll get into, but there's something about this feel that is so solid and confidence-inducing, which solves one of the little issues I have on other foam paddles. I love the feel of foam because it extends dwell time, but unlike soft, mushy paddles, you still feel the ball in the paddle face, but there are times on the Yolas and the Gearboxes that I find them a little bit hollow. It's not a muted feel, I want to make that clear, but sometimes I get a little surprised by the dwell time either being longer or shorter than I was expecting, and that changes the quality of my shot. That makes them a little inconsistent at times, and testing them back to back with the Ripple, I can't help but feel that this firmness makes it more connected to the ball, which ends up making it more consistent. I'm going to quickly play a clip of me and my buddy dinking because you can actually hear the sound difference between the Ripple and the Gearbox Pro Ultimate, and that sound difference mirrors the feel quite well.
Mediocre, up, so you've got just a little bit
You can hear that the Ripple has a sharper, richer sound and that the Pro Ultimate is more thuddy and hollow. Now translate that sound to feel and you have the difference between the Ripple and other foam paddles. Kudos to you, Ronbus. It feels like you fixed an issue with foam paddles that wasn't even too noticeable, and I have to say, if you were to ask me which paddle right now provides the best feel for the ball, it's the Ripple. Now I know I've spent enough time on feel and I don't want to bore you too much with sweet spot, so I'll be brief. The sweet spot is huge. It's to be expected. All these foam paddles have massive sweet spots. I explained this in more detail in the Yola Mod TA review we did last week, so you can go watch that after this, but because foam is so flexible, you get a very forgiving feel all around the paddle face. It may be a little bit smaller than the 16mm foam paddle sweet spots, which again makes sense. Generally, as you go thinner, the sweet spot concentrates into a smaller part of the paddle face. But yeah, still a huge sweet spot. Obviously incredible feel like I've mentioned a million times now, and a more consistent response than some of its foam competition. The Ripple is an addictive paddle to play with, but now we need to know if it's competitive in terms of power, spin, and control. You probably guessed it from what I said about the foam and grid pattern acting together to apply more force onto the ball. Power is absolutely incredible on the Ripple. It kind of works like this. Take 90% of the springy feel of paddles like the Gen 3 Yolas, add a firmer exit point, and that sort of acts like a backboard so that more energy is directly transferred into the ball. It feels like this paddle just has a bit more punch than the other foam paddles, and that punch has a very positive effect on pop. Pop is basically how hard a paddle deflects the ball back when you're not able to generate a full stroke. You generally want high pop at the net because a poppy paddle will push the ball through the court with very little effort. I'm going to use the example of a tennis racket versus a pickleball paddle to explain this, because this is by far the closest thing to a tennis racket that I've ever used. The main difference between a pickleball paddle and a tennis racket is that contact on a tennis racket transfers more power into the ball, and on a pickleball paddle, it generally takes away from it. The first paddles to actually amplify power were foam paddles, because foam essentially does the same thing that strings do in a tennis racket. They both add a spring effect. Still, I didn't want to say that foam paddles like the Yolas or the gearboxes were that similar to tennis rackets, because the hollowness they have is not something you ever feel in tennis. With a tennis racket, the ball sinks into the strings, loading up on power, and those strings are backed by a stiff carbon frame, which creates quite a rigid response on contact, and that amplifies power. What I was saying earlier about the Ripple having a springy but rigid feel is what makes it so similar to that contact on a tennis racket. It's able to direct such insane amounts of power onto the ball, and because of that, you have the ability to hit a lot of shots with similar technique you would use in tennis, especially tennis-style volleys. In tennis, instead of swinging at a volley, you punch through it, keeping your wrist locked, not actually trying to add power to it, because the spring effect of the strings and the rigidity of the frame are more than enough. Doing that with a soft paddle will result in a pretty wimpy volley that's easy to pick up for your opponent, but I was able to hit putaways with that technique on the Ripple, which is pretty impressive. What's even better is that this is still a pickleball paddle, which, unlike a tennis racket, is really easy to maneuver up at the net, especially this one, which is super aerodynamic and has low weight specs. If you do decide to swing on your volleys, which I also recommend, that just amplifies pop even further. The amount of times that just added a little flick of the wrist to a volley and it instantly ended the point was pretty special. It's kind of a magic wand up there. I've never used something so effective at ending points out of nowhere. Now, power on ground strokes is also elite, but I did mention earlier that it only has about 90% of the spring effect of a Yola paddle or a Gearbox Pro Power, so it is just a little bit under when you're taking a full stroke, but the difference is marginal. I only felt it when I was going back and forth between the two, and to be honest, power from the baseline is nice, but you're rarely going to overpower your opponent from back there, so if there is a difference, it's negligible in terms of performance. What's more important from the baseline is a paddle's power to spin ratio, because power is great, but you need spin to control it, and my word does this paddle have spin. At this point, I think we've been through 3 major revolutions in terms of how much spin and what type of spin you can put on a pickleball. The first one came with the introduction of carbon top sheets, which made paddles grab at the ball more effectively. The second one came with thermoforming, which more directly transferred energy from your technique through to the ball. Then the third revolution would be softer thermoform paddles like Kevlar paddles, which have a longer dwell time and that makes it easier to shape the ball when it's in the paddle face. I'm saying it right now, the Ronbus Ripple is the start of the 4th spin revolution. It's as simple as that. I've never felt an ability to hit this much spin and this variety of spin with a pickleball paddle. You've got the carbon top sheet, it's thermoformed, the dwell time is obviously very long because it's a foam paddle, and that spring effect also amplifies spin on the ball. Unlike other foam paddles though, that more solid feel on the Ripple gives you quite a bit more purchase over the ball, or at least a feeling that you're in control of your spin a lot more. I was always a little hesitant to say that spin was perfect on other foam paddles because that hollowness made me feel like I lost a little bit of control over how the ball would spin coming off the paddle face. There were even times when, because the dwell time was so long and so soft, it almost felt like the ball was slipping off the paddle face and I wasn't getting the spin I thought I was putting on it. It's very tough to describe, but if I am going to put it simply, it feels like the difference in spin between the Ripple and other foam paddles is a little bit like the difference in spin between a thermoform paddle and a non-thermoform paddle, although much less extreme. It feels like that more solid exit point is exactly what you need to maintain feel for the ball all the way through contact, which gives you more control over your spin so you benefit even more from the foam's inherent spring effect. I'm going to play some clips here so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I pushed this thing to the absolute limit trying to test just how much spin it had, and honestly, I don't think I ever got to its full potential. The shape I'm putting on some of these shots is quite frankly ridiculous, and as you can imagine, when you combine that amount of spin with this much power, it's a deadly recipe.
Oh, dude, this is crazy. This is literally a tennis racket.
In pickleball, I've never been able to swing this hard, either on passing shots or on serve, because I was so confident that it would spin the ball enough to control my swing speed, and that made it a deadly weapon in these situations. My serve was so consistent. It would land deep and pop high off the ground, pushing my opponent super far, and a good serve is huge in pickleball because it makes it harder for your opponent to take control off of a good return. I've also never felt this confident hitting spin on two-handed backhands. I really need to dig into the ball and brush up a lot for that type of shot, and this is really the first paddle I've ever felt confident doing that on a consistent basis. I honestly think this is the best paddle for spin I've ever tested. It's maybe a little bit worse for soft spin than it is for powerful spin because of that spring effect, but you just have to learn to control it, and it's probably still the best. Speaking of control, is this where the shoe drops? You could say that, you could also not say that, so I'm going to do a bit of both. Yes, because this paddle is so powerful, so springy, and it's firmer than the average foam paddle, it's not inherently controlled, at least not in the traditional sense. On returns at the beginning of my playtest, I was consistently pushing the ball too deep. This is a shot I still chip instead of hitting with spin, so it's harder to control that very powerful launch, and it took me quite a few games before I stopped accidentally overhitting my returns. The Ripple also doesn't cushion the ball at all, so it's not forgiving in the soft game. That's not the type of paddle it is, so if you don't have soft hands, you're going to really struggle to control your drops, dinks, and resets. I was actually using the brand new Vanguard Pro Invicta at the same time I was testing the Ripple, which is a really soft paddle in the control game, and the difference was night and day. That one is super easy to dink with, the Ripple was way easier to overhit. With that said, there is one extremely important caveat to all that: this paddle's feel. Like I said earlier, this has, in my opinion, the best feel of any paddle right now. What does that mean for the control game? Well, it means that you're super connected to the ball, so you know exactly how it's going to shoot off the paddle face when it does. When I did accidentally overpower a drop, I knew right away. The paddle gave me feedback that I had hit a bad shot, and eventually, after enough time with it, I grew to have a perfect understanding of what I need to do to drop it perfectly into the kitchen. I can't stress how important feel is in the control game, especially when things get a little more random, like when you're trying to reset a point. If you have a really cushioned paddle, but it doesn't have good feel, dinking will be easy because you can almost robotically do the same motion over and over, but when you're scrambling to hit a drop you haven't drilled a million times, you lose the ball in the paddle face. Now, of course, dwell time is also very important in the control game, especially when you combine it with good feel, because it gives you a bit more time to guide the ball, so I would be curious to see how a 16mm Ripple plays, but this is still excellent. Foam is inherently soft, so dwell time here is longer than average. Not as long as on the Yolas or the Gearbox Pro Ultimate, but because this paddle is more consistent, I actually think it's a little bit better in the control game. Once I got used to the Ripple, I rarely missed a touch shot. It does take a while to get there, and it's still never going to be easy for control, but it's elite in the right player's hands. There is one thing I want to add in this section. The reason you drop a ball into the kitchen is either to reset the point or because it's a higher probability shot that gives you more of a chance to stay in the point than another shot would. It's your margin shot, and you need that in any racket or paddle sport, but with the Ripple, I was so confident hitting with spin that kind of became my default margin shot more than a touch shot. It gave me so much confidence that I could hit my spots in the spin game that I was rarely defaulting to the touch game when I was in a sticky situation, and honestly, I won more points because of it. At some point, I started forcing myself to hit with more touch just for the sake of this review, which proved to me that this paddle can hold its own there, but I still would rather hit a spinny passing shot in most situations, where on other paddles I would reset the ball into the kitchen. And again, I want to make it clear that that's more of a testament to its insane spin rather than a knock on its control. I've got 20 years of experience in tennis and only 5 years in pickleball, so I'm more comfortable hitting a spin shot in most situations, and this gives me the ability to do that more than any other paddle I've hit with. If I am going to summarize the Ripple in one word, and let's be honest, I've done a lot more than that throughout this review, that word would be responsive. What I've always been searching for in my years playing this sport is a paddle that allows me to use the skills I've learned playing tennis on the pickleball court. A paddle that responds to my input. The Ripple is the latest evolution of a paddle that can manipulate a pickleball in the same way that a racket can manipulate a tennis ball in every sense of the word. For power, yes, but more impressively for spin and feel. I really couldn't believe it throughout my playtest. I mean, you heard some of the sound bites. I was shocked as to how well it responded to what I told it to do. And I gave it to another buddy of mine who comes from a tennis background, and he started playing lights out as well. Based off of what I just said, I think it's pretty obvious that the Ripple is made for players who are super offensive, who like to dictate points and also like to end them early. The potential it has to do that is off the charts. Huge power and pop at the net, ridiculous angles off the toughest spin shots, and you can start things off pretty well with a massive serve. I know that's more of a tennis style of play, which not everyone wants to do in pickleball, and it's definitely better for singles than it is for doubles, but it's not limited in the control game. In fact, if you're the type of player who really appreciates good feel, it's one of the best paddles for control in that regard. I have to say, going back to more normal paddles, they felt kind of bland. Ronbus has created a paddle that gives better feel for this little plastic ball than I ever thought was going to be possible. I do think if you're a lower level player, you A, won't get the most out of this paddle, and B, it will limit you in the touch game because it does have a layer of difficulty that most other paddles don't. I would avoid it if you're not at least a 4.0 level player, which is the same thing I've been saying for pretty much every other foam paddle. While I do think this one is a little bit more consistent than the others, I'm gonna maintain that. Now from a personal point of view, I do just want to say to Dong and the engineers over at Ronbus, this is amazing work. The Ripple is an absolutely phenomenal paddle that you should be extremely proud of, and please keep it up because you're killing it. I'm under no obligation to say any of that, by the way. They're not paying me. We don't need to sell the Ripple any more than we do any other paddle. In fact, it's already sold out. It's just awesome to play with something like this. When you're constantly analyzing product the way I am, you think of a lot of things. You think of how things could improve, the changes you would make to something, and this ticks a lot of those boxes. I think if I had sat down and told you all the ways I thought a Yola Gen 3 paddle could improve, it would have looked a lot like the Ripple. I also just want to say I've explained some pretty complex sensations throughout this review, so if you do need clarification on any of it, please don't hesitate to ask me in the comments, but the best thing to do would definitely be demoing it because it is so unique. With that said, that is going to be the end of this super long review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo the Ripple or any of the other paddles that we carry, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.